Welcome to the lecture for Chapter 14, Aggregate Supply, and the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In this chapter, we're going to look at two explanations for why prices might not adjust, why they're sticky. Then we'll look at the historical relationship between inflation and unemployment, which is described by the Phillips curve. There we go. The ISLM model is a very useful model of the economy in the short run when prices are fixed, but it's a theory of aggregate demand, and it has to be combined with a theory of aggregate supply to get a complete picture of the economy. The reason for this is that the assumption of perfectly sticky prices, and from that a horizontal short-run aggregate supply curve, is not very helpful to understanding how the economy actually functions. This is the upward sloping supply curve that you learned in principles. If demand increases from D1 to D2, both price and quantity will go up. This is a supply curve that is very elastic. If demand increases here, most of the change is expressed in an increase in quantity and a very small change in price. Here is a very inelastic supply curve, and we see the opposite. Demand increases, we see a big change in price and a very small change in quantity. Now, let's go to the extremes of elasticity in the aggregate supply curve. Here we have a perfectly inelastic long-run aggregate supply curve. This is the classical model of the macroeconomy in the long run. When demand goes up here, prices go up, but output doesn't change at all. Now, why would the long-run aggregate supply curve be vertical? We know that in the long run, output depends only on technology, capital, labor. Also, long-run analysis of the economy is conducted entirely in real terms. The supply of goods and services in the long run doesn't depend on the price level. It only depends on real factors. So, long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. Economic growth here is captured in the long-run aggregate supply curve, slowly shifting right over time as technology improves, or maybe the economy gets more capital and more labor. Why is it not upward sloping like in your principles class? Think of it this way. P on the vertical axis here is the price level of everything. It's the aggregate price level in the economy. So if prices go up by 10%, that means on average everything costs 10% more. So yeah, a firm could get 10% more revenue for each unit it sells, but it's also going to pay 10% more in wages, 10% more in the price of inputs, the factors of production, advertising, everything. So nothing real has changed. If the prices of everything double, the firm has no reason to change its current level of output. Now this, with the short-run aggregate supply curve, is the Keynesian model of the economy in the short run. Prices here are fixed, which is why the short-run aggregate supply curve is horizontal. It's perfectly elastic in the short run. In this model, if demand goes up from D1 to D2, output goes up, but prices don't change. Why would prices not change in the short run? A couple of reasons. First, prices take time to change. In the short run, you may have contractual obligations that prevent you from changing prices. Maybe a long-run contract with your customers, where you've agreed to sell to them at a fixed price. Maybe you have a union contract, which controls what you're going to pay your workers, um, so that you can't change wages in the short run. Second, menu costs. The term menu costs came from the cost of physically reprinting menus in a restaurant when you need to change prices. But it means, in economic terms, more broadly, the cost involved in changing prices. Maybe you have to bring all of your salespeople in off the road temporarily and put them through a seminar in the new price structures. That's a cost. That would also be a menu cost. Third, if you change your prices too frequently, it can confuse your customers. They may not like it, so you may simply delay changing prices until you can't delay anymore and then make one big price change. Let's look at two different types of firms. Firms that can change prices and firms that can't. And let's see how each of them responds to a sudden change in economic conditions. We call that an economic shock. Here we're going to look at a demand shock. Now the key here is this. The idea of expected prices. Both firms have expectations about what the aggregate price level in the economy will be later that day. But they both could be wrong. If the flexible price firm guesses wrong, it doesn't matter because they can change prices instantly from second to second as economic conditions demand. But the sticky price firm, think of a restaurant. They make a decision first thing in the morning about what their prices will be over the course of the day. They print the menus in the morning. After that's done, they're stuck with that price until the next day. So for that day, if it turns out they guessed wrong, they're going to have to sell at the wrong price. This is the flexible price restaurant. I love this little graphic I made. I don't know why, I just do. The owner of this restaurant has perfect market knowledge at all times, can change prices at any second, and experiences stochastic shocks to demand. Stochastic meaning random. Now, the owner of this restaurant wants to keep all the seats full, but with no line outside waiting to get in. That's because if there's an empty seat, well, that's revenue that they could be getting. But if there's a line out front, well, then that means that the owner could increase prices and still keep a full house. So if there's a negative demand shock, for some reason, all of a sudden people don't want to eat out so much, the owner will instantly know that and will reduce prices to keep every seat full but no line to get in. If there's a positive demand shock, demand suddenly shifts right. Everybody, for whatever reason, decides we all want to go out and eat. Well, then this owner would know and would increase prices, again, to keep the house full, but with no line outside. Now, this is the sticky price restaurant. Just like in the flexible price restaurant, this owner also has perfect knowledge of the market at all times. It's not a problem of knowledge. It's a problem of ability to respond to it. This owner sets prices at the start of the day to what she expects the general price level to be. And again, like the flexible price restaurant, will experience stochastic demand shocks. Now, if demand turns out to be higher than she expected, well, that means her price is too low, but she's committed to producing whatever quantity the market demands at the sticky price. So she will increase production to meet that higher demand. In other words, her cheeseburgers are priced accidentally too low. There will be a flood of customers in the door, and she'll increase the quantity of cheeseburgers produced to meet that higher demand instead of raising the price because she can't. If demand turns out to be lower than she expected, so the correct price is lower than what she expected them to be, that means her price for the day is too high. Business will be slow. She can't lower prices, so instead, since business is slow, she'll just decrease production. Now, this is the simple mathematical model of both of these restaurants. Y on the left is aggregate output. Y bar is the long run natural rate of output. P is the actual price level. EP is what the owners expected the price level to be during the day. Alpha, for now, that's just a positive parameter. Okay. If there's a demand shock in the sticky price restaurant, output will change, but prices won't. In the flexible, the flexible price restaurant, output changes, but prices don't. Alpha is essentially the ratio of the two types of restaurants. Let's assume that all restaurants were sticky price. Then alpha would be 1. And in response to a demand shock, where the actual price level in the economy is different than what was expected, this term will be large, and output will be the natural rate, the long run, plus or minus this term. If all restaurants were flexible price, alpha is 0. And this term, whether there's a demand shock or not, output doesn't change. Prices change. Okay. We know that the supply of goods and services in the long run depends on real things, technology, capital, labor. We also know that long-run analysis is done entirely in real terms. So the supply of goods and services in the long run doesn't depend on the price level. So this means that the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to be vertical at this level. In comparison, if prices are perfectly sticky, then an increase in demand. Here, an increase in demand from the blue to the red only increases prices in the long run. Output doesn't change. If all prices are sticky, then an increase in demand from the blue curve to the red curve increases output, and prices don't change. Now, in the real economy, prices are neither perfectly sticky nor perfectly flexible. The degree of stickiness in this simple model is determined by the ratio of the two types of firms. Alpha. Well, alpha is therefore also the degree to which monetary or fiscal policy will work. If alpha is small, that is mostly flexible price firms, then output is mostly going to be at its long run equilibrium, determined by real factors, and Keynesian stimulus won't work very well at all. If alpha is large, mostly sticky price firms, then Keynesian stimulus will work pretty well. People's expectations of the price level will sometimes be too high and sometimes too low, but on average, they will be accurate. Here, if a sticky price firm believes that the overall price level is going to be this is their prediction, expected price, then the actual price level, assuming they didn't guess perfectly, and no one ever will be perfect in their guesses, the actual price level is either going to turn out to be lower than expected at P1 or higher than expected at P2. If prices turn out lower than expected here, then firms' prices, which are stuck here, are going to be too high. If your prices are too high, people won't want to buy much from you, and output will shrink. But if prices turn out to be higher than you expected, well, that means in real terms, your prices are too low. Everybody's going to want to buy from you, and output will be above its long-term equilibrium. Given that prices are neither perfectly flexible nor perfectly sticky, we get a short-run aggregate supply curve that is in between horizontal and the long-run vertical. If prices turn out to be higher than expected in this range, then that's unexpected inflation. And in the short run, output will go up because firms are selling things at a price that's temporarily too low. On the other hand, if prices turn out to be lower than expected in this range, well, that's unexpected deflation, and output will go down because firms are selling things at a price that's temporarily too high. Now, the second model of aggregate supply, explaining why prices might be sticky in the short run, is known as the Lucas Imperfect Information Model. It assumes that markets do clear, so prices and wages are free to adjust so that supply equals demand. Unlike the previous model, where both restaurant owners knew what the prices should be at any given moment. They had perfect knowledge, it's just one of them couldn't act on it. Here, all firm owners can change prices at any moment, but they have a mistaken belief about what prices should be. This is also called the Lucas Island model. It was developed by Robert Lucas, a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the early 1970s, with help from Milton Friedman, who also won the Nobel. It's called the Lucas Island model because you can think of each producer as being on a separate little island where they know what's going on locally on their island, but they don't know what's happening in the economy as a whole. Now, imagine that you own one of these firms. You're on your own little island, and you make widgets. When you open the cash drawer at the end of every day, on average, there's $1,000 in there. But today you look in the cash drawer and you see there's $2,000 in the drawer. Well, you know there are two possible explanations for why there's so much money in the cash drawer. One explanation It's possible that for some reason people just decided they want more widgets than they used to. Demand has shifted right. Um, if that's the case, then you should increase output. But there's another possibility. Maybe it's not an increase in demand. Maybe it's a general increase in the price level, inflation. If that's the case, then you should not change your level of output because, yeah, there's more money coming in, but you're going to have more money going out too. The price of all of your inputs to production, the factors of production, labor, etc., will all have gone up. So if the prices of everything have doubled, then you have no reason to change your behavior. Um, Now, the flow of information takes time. So you can see the increase in the money in your cash drawer right away, but you're going to have to wait to find out if it's a general increase in the price level. If the price of your inputs have also doubled, you're not going to find that out until later when your vendors come to you with their bills and their new price levels. So that's why you don't know the cause of the change at the point where you have to make a decision about whether to increase output or not. So the Lucas Island model says that producers are unable to distinguish perfectly between, on the one hand, a shock to the price of their own output, which would lead them to change their production, and on the other hand, a shock to the general price level. And the best response to that is do not change output. Given that you do observe this positive shock, a producer's best response is a compromise to hedge their bets. So in this model, if a producer sees an increase in sales, they will increase output, but only some. They won't increase production as much as if they would if they were certain it was all a real increase in demand. Now, exactly how much they increase output depends on their beliefs about the relative probabilities of the cause in the change. If you believe it's probably a real change in demand, then you'll increase output a fairly large amount. But if you believe it's probably just a change in the general price level and nothing real has changed, then you might just increase output a little bit. This is why expectations in this model are critically important. If people believe demand shocks are probably real things, then they will respond very strongly to the change by increasing or decreasing output. But if people believe demand shocks are more often than not just a result of an unexpected change in the overall price level, inflation or deflation, then they won't respond very much to those changes at all. This also means that if people expect prices to be very volatile, then Keynesian stimulus spending is not going to have much of an effect. It's not going to work well. If the government spends a huge amount of money all of a sudden, and some of that ends up in your cash drawer, you're going to tell yourself, well, looks like we're having more inflation again, and you won't increase output. But if, on the other hand, you expect prices to be very stable, and then government increases spending, stimulates demand, and some of that ends up in your cash drawer, you're going to believe it's all a real change in demand for your product, and you will increase output, which means government stimulus, fiscal or monetary in that case, will have a large effect on the real economy. It will work. Now, there are good reasons to believe that the short-run aggregate supply curve is bow-shaped like this in the real world. That is, its slope is steeper at high levels of output than at low levels of output. And there are good reasons why we should care about this. At low levels of output, there are lots of underutilized resources available. So it's not terribly expensive for firms to increase output. So firms don't require a big increase in prices to make them willing to increase output. On contrast to very high levels of output, when unemployment is below its natural level, capital is already being utilized at a very high level, very high intensity. It's going to be much more expensive to increase output even further. So it requires a larger increase in price, the rise, to cause the same level of output increase, the run. The slope is steeper. Now, why does this matter? When policymakers increase aggregate demand through stimulus spending or an increase in the money supply, it increases output to some degree, which is good. But it also raises prices to some degree, which is bad. So an important question comes up. How much of the bad thing, higher prices, do we have to tolerate to get some of the good thing, higher output? The answer depends on how steep the short-run aggregate supply curve is. When President Reagan cut taxes in the early 80s, the economy was just coming out of a severe recession, so we were on the flatter part of the curve. Therefore, the tax cuts increased output a lot and inflation only a little. At times when we're on the steeper part of the curve, when we're already in boom times, further stimulus of the economy would likely have more of an inflationary effect and less of an increase in output. Now, this inverse relationship between output and prices has been observed empirically over many decades. There was a famous 1958 paper by economist William Phillips, which analyzed this pattern, that over time, when inflation was high, unemployment tended to be low. And when inflation was low, unemployment tended to be high. This is the data from the early mid-20th century from the paper. You can see it's very noisy, but still, there is a discernible negative relationship between inflation, expressed here as change in real wages, and unemployment. High inflation, you tended to have low unemployment. Low inflation, you tended to have higher unemployment. This is that same data expressed in a much less noisy fashion. High inflation, low unemployment, etc. Now, up through the mid-1970s, economists, and this goes for almost all of them, I wasn't an economist yet. I was just a little teeny economist, so I wasn't part of this. I would have been, but economists, the consensus was, in retrospect, an obvious mistake. They saw that in the past, high inflation usually happened at the same time as low unemployment. They mistook correlation with causation. They assumed that high inflation must cause low unemployment. Well, that leads to a policy mistake. People assumed that causing inflation would cause lower unemployment. This trade-off between inflation and unemployment. People believed that they could control employment with Keynesian stimulus. This was the logic of how it would work. If you stimulate the economy through monetary or fiscal policy to increase demand for labor, wages will go up. People will spend these wages. That will drive the prices of things people buy up, and you'll end up with a higher price level and lower unemployment. This is the Phillips curve, fitted to data for the United States from 1961 to 1969. There's a very close fit between the estimated curve and the data. That made economists treat the Phillips curve as kind of a menu of policy options. For example, with an unemployment rate of 6%, the government might stimulate the economy to lower unemployment to 5%. The cost in terms of higher inflation would be a little more than half a percentage point increase. And this was repeatedly attempted. In 1968, Milton Friedman said that the Phillips curve was only applicable to the very short run, and in the long run, inflationary policies would not reduce unemployment. It wasn't until the mid-70s that most economists started to believe him. The reason is that during the 1970s, the United States had, and I actually remember this, both very high inflation and high unemployment. Prices were skyrocketing and the economy was not growing. Now, since the economy was not growing, it was said we had a stagnant economic growth plus inflation, so people came up with this new word to describe it, stagflation. Now, traditional Keynesian economics, including the Phillips curve, predicted that this was impossible. The experience of the 1970s showed that no, it is possible, and it to some degree discredited some of Keynesian economic theories. The experience of the 70s turned the economic consensus to a large degree away from Keynesianism and towards Milton Friedman's monetary theories. Now, when you view this relationship from the Lucas Island model perspective, it explains a lot more. This equation indicates that when expected future inflation, or more correctly, the future price level, is completely accurate, then this last term drops out. So the actual price level equals the natural long-term level of GDP determined by real forces. So in the Lucas aggregate supply curve, the only reason why actual GDP should be different from its long-term natural rate is because of an incorrect expectation of what's going to happen with future prices. If the expected price level, the inflation rate, was exactly right, then Keynesian stimulus would never work. Let's see. So this implies that traditional Keynesian economic stimulus only works to the extent that you can essentially successfully fool people into believing that the change they see is a real increase in demand instead of just a change in the aggregate price level, which is what it really is. Now, Milton Friedman argued that in the long run, workers and employers will learn to take inflation into account. They will have employment contracts that increase pay at rates nearer anticipated inflation. And so over the longer run, unemployment would begin to rise back up to its previous level after stimulus but now with higher inflation rates. Um, this means that over the long run, there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Um, so central banks should not attempt to stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply. The process of people learning and changing their expectations in response to previous policy decisions leads us to the Lucas critique. This is a quote from the paper. You can stop the video and read it at your leisure. What it means is, just because you've seen a relationship between economic variables in the past does not mean that you can use that relationship to change the economy in the present. Not only because the relationship you saw in the past may not have been causal, but also, even if it was causal, your attempt to use the relationship to change the economy will itself change that relationship. Um, if you stimulate the economy with higher government spending or an increase in the money supply enough times, eventually people will learn. They will come to expect it, and your stimulus will stop working. This is a classic way that's explained to work. You have a policy decision, and let's say you don't take the Lucas critique into consideration. You're trying to decide how much to spend on guards at Fort Knox. Now, you know in the past, Fort Knox has never been robbed. Well, if that's the past pattern, you might try to use that in the future to say, well, then we can save money by not spending on guards. The Lucas critique says that just because Fort Knox has never been robbed in the past does not mean that you can get rid of guards today and it'll still not be robbed. Your policy change today will change the relationship today between guards and robbery. So if you try to save money by not hiring guards, Fort Knox is going to be robbed. That's it for this lecture. I hope you found it interesting.